So in 2017, we undertook some research into the relative prioritization of 4 kind of policy areas: accountability, pupil premium, high attaining pupils, and pupils with SEND. And we looked at their prioritization amongst a really wide group of educationalists. So the people we spoke to were head teachers, MAT CEOs, directors of children's services, and senior DFE civil servants. And we found that people were aware that SEND should be on their radar, but that this didn't always translate into action, or very seldom translated into action, because SEND's relative prioritization amongst educationalists still lagged behind those other areas. Then, in case studies from our 2018 report on cultures and practices in schools, in which we spoke to pupils, teachers, parents, governors, and leaders in 23 schools across the country, which generated nearly 9,000 minutes of interview data, discussion of SEND barely featured. And this really shocked me. We talked about we had conversations about so many aspects of school culture and school life, and SEND rarely came up, certainly didn't come up without prompting. And when I think about it, it's only when our research explicitly asks about issues relating to SEND that policymakers and practitioners even talk about it. So this is obviously partly an indictment of practice in mainstream schools, but it's a direction that's set, intentionally or otherwise, from the centre. So, for example, I was reading last week's APPG report on the experiences of young people with SEND during COVID. And I think the most common complaint was that amongst all the kind of hastily drafted reams of guidance that the DfE put out, SEND, special schools, and alternative provision were an afterthought at best, and most often not included at all. So in this book chapter, we ask, how often do you hear education ministers mentioning, challenging, or celebrating SEND provision in schools? How often do you read about anything other than the failings of children with SEND in newspapers? So greater emphasis from the centre and the kind of clear thinking about SEND in schools, in mainstream schools, that I talked about at the start, and not just from the SENCO and the teaching assistant, is possible. So pupil premium, for example, is a really clear example of how a policy direction set from the centre can quite quickly lead to a greater focus on outcomes for a group of pupils, generating a proliferation of interventions, focus from governors, an explicit lens in inspections, and a ubiquitous feature of curriculum planning from senior and middle leaders to the classroom levels. And I'm convinced that we have the solution to many of the problems that lead to so many young people with SEND being on the margins of our education system. But not all those solutions are the preserve of educationists alone. One of the core themes of this book, as Loic mentioned in his keynote, is the impact of poverty on young people. And this is definitely true for many, again, not all, but many pupils with SEND. The causal pathway between many special needs and disabilities and poverty runs both ways. And as a result, the two are often intertwined. How, therefore, can we work together to advocate for a reduction in child poverty and trust that this underpins many of the educational challenges facing young people with SEND? Another of this chapter's themes is partnership. And the classic silo for young people and families with SEND is often between the support they receive at school and other forms of support, benefits, health, mental health, holidays, respite. The landscape's changed dramatically in recent years. The local authority role isn't what it was, but is still the hub in many ways, and often intervention takes place elsewhere and is fragmented. So what can we do to strengthen the ways in which services work together? Are we asking too much of local authorities or too little? How do we also ensure that young people in special schools or those with SEND in alternative provision are not on the margins, and that ideas and practice are shared between those settings and the mainstream? These are tangible questions with solutions that are surely within our grasp. So I think our job collectively is to make it clear that answering these questions and bringing SEND in from the margins to the centre of thinking about education should be key to any leader in the system, whether they're a leader within their classroom or the Secretary of State. SEND should be placed closer to the centre of practice in mainstream schools. And in doing so, we might then avoid the pitfalls that occur when young people with SEND are marginalised from the school system altogether. So I realise I've covered quite a lot of general points there. raised in the chapter. I hope that gives you a flavour of the sort of thing that we do talk about. And I'd like to open it up now to questions from the floor. Feel free to unmute yourselves and come in with any questions.
Can I challenge you, Bart, on the idea that there's not already an explicit lens on SEN? So your analogy of could we do something that's more like pupil premium? But actually we already do stuff that's pretty similar. There's meant to be a governor allocated. There is a budget that's allocated. There's an area of the Ofsted inspection that has to look at it. How much more of an explicit lens will it take?
Yeah, I definitely don't disagree with you, and I think what I'm trying to say is that, so even in those examples you give, it's like there's a governor on the governing body who's responsible for SEND, and often those conversations on governing bodies happen with that governor and the head teacher, the safeguarding lead, the SENCO, and they aren't necessarily the focus of the full governors meeting or what every governor thinks about, but in a way where, and I don't want to bang on about the analogy with pupil premium because it isn't perfect and it doesn't work in many ways, but I'd say with conversations around pupil premium, they are built into every conversation in every governor's meeting, that every governor is thinking about, what's the progress of disadvantaged pupils in this school, and I don't think that's the same for SEND. I might be wrong, and you're very, very welcome to challenge me on that. But I think it is. I think it's an example of that kind of idea that SEND is some sort of specialism and the preserve of specialists, and therefore for the average governor or for the average teacher in schools, that it isn't something that is necessarily, I think people understand it's their responsibility, but I don't think that translates into actually thinking about it clearly every day. And I think you're also right in that there is a lens in Ofsted, and I think there's probably been quite a positive step in that direction from Ofsted in recognising that they should be asking more questions about SEND. And I think one of the things that doesn't, it's interesting talking to people in Ofsted about how the expertise that inspectors have, and I think it's recognised in Ofsted, but on many issues, not just SEND, that expertise could be improved. And I think it's maybe another area where that kind of collaboration between specialist settings and mainstream settings could improve things.
I was just interested in the kind of governance perspective as well. As I just mentioned in the chat, I've been a governor for 12 years now in a school where 30% of the intake has some form of SEND, and we have a specialism autism resource base for 10 pupils. And the policy, for example, around those resource bases has really changed in the time that I've been a governor, but over the kind of lifetime of them, in terms of those children would reintegrate into the mainstream fully by the end of year 6, and now that isn't the case. They go to special secondary schools. And I think the difference for me around the pupil premium is that often people, because they don't know what good could or should look like for these pupils, whereas with pupil premium you can quite easily go, well, they should be achieving at the same level as their peers. And anyone who has even a basic understanding of data can look at that and go, that's not level yet, we've more to do. And I think for me as well, the impact of funding, I don't see as clear a rationale for the spend. And this, as I've been special SEND governor, I've been the chair of governors, I've been in all sorts of roles in and around it, but I don't get that same clarity on the impact of funding from experienced practitioners who are doing great work. So I think that can be quite tricky as well.
I really like to hear other people's perspectives, but just really quickly, one of the things I found most difficult about writing this chapter, and that sort of led to that kind of brain freeze at the start of the writing process, was just how different and varied the needs and experiences of young people with SEND are, to the point where as a label, we all know that it's fairly contested, and that there are lots of thoughts about how useful it is as a label. And I think this, so it's, I agree with you, Caroline. I think there are pupils where you could be having the same conversations as you do with pupil premium about how does this group of pupils progress compare to the average or the or pupils without those levels, without SEND. And there are other pupils for whom that conversation would be utterly meaningless. Mm-hmm. So how do you encourage, how do you direct funding towards a group of pupils who have needs, but in a way that takes account the kind of extreme variation of needs? Maybe that's a question I'll pose to everyone in this room. But also, if you have other questions, please do.
Well, I do have quite a simple policy solution. It doesn't fix the whole thing, but it would make a massive leap towards answering some of those questions. And that's to standardise the HCP forms, because they're different for every local authority. Yeah. And so from a researcher's point of view, Bart, you can't actually compare outcomes, because you don't know what interventions are being put in place, because each form has slightly different criteria and slightly different recording and different interventions. So you can't actually at the moment look at what's being done, and you could very quickly, from a policy point of view, centralise that and then start collecting data that would start to give us at every level of the system some answers.
And there's a real tension, isn't there, that's kind of been like an unintended consequence that's been built into the EHCP system of creating this kind of local, but by creating the local offer, you then have different criteria of what young people are entitled to in different local areas, which again then sort of fragments reform. But at the same time, I can see that you do want to build on what is available locally and on people's needs. But I think the other big question for me is then, I totally agree. I think EHCP reform is needed. I'm really interested to see what's in the SEND review when it is published. I haven't seen it yet, so but I suspect there'll be quite a lot on reforming the EHCP system. And what I'm less clear about is what will be in there, or what ideas there are about reforming the kind of the system of SEND support for all those people who are kind of more in the mainstream but still marginalised.
Yeah, just building on that, so in Oxfordshire we've recently been told that our speech and language therapists won't accept any more referrals because they are at capacity, and they will only come in and see young people with EHCPs. So all of that early intervention and picking children up, and we know, don't we, the links between communication and interaction needs, and then how that can come out as behaviour needs, and then linking onto exclusions. But there's no external support available to mainstream schools to get kind of more specialist advice on difficulties their young people might be facing. And I just think that, so streamlining HCP formats, but also streamlining the support, the services available to children across authorities, because it is a postcode lottery depending on how different, NHS systems and all of that kind of choose to work, the support that's available. And that just seems ridiculously unfair, doesn't it, that you can get different support depending on where you're living.
Yeah, it's definitely a story we hear in lots of different places.
Sorry.
Hi, sorry, it's Rachel here. My video is off because I'm actually being mummy today. So I'm currently plaiting a doll's hair. I'm just fascinated by this discussion. I'm really sorry to hear about what's going on in Oxfordshire. That's shocking. And I totally agree about the changing of the EHC plan format. I'm also I'm an education consultant. I work across schools supporting them, and I'm also an SEN parent. So my point really is agreeing with what Bart said about the label itself. My experience is so often the case that in schools, students are, the expectations are so much less of students with SEND. And also I'm just deeply discouraged by our system, which is so heavily weighted on English and maths achievement and academic achievement, when so many of these students are so gifted in other areas, yet go into their adult life believing they're inferior to others because of their perhaps lack of academic, in inverted commas. I mean, I could talk for hours about this, but I've just the debate is making my stomach churn with excitement, because I think all of these points are so important. And thanks for your work, Bart. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's definitely, I'm summarising the work that's happening from lots of people across the country who are more expert than I.
Yeah.
Is anyone in this room from a special school or work in specialist provision?
Yeah, I do. I'm Sarah. Yeah.
What's your take on the sort of on not within your setting, but kind of the I guess the centrally set drivers of expectations around outcomes for pupils in special schools?
So I'm new to special provision, so I only joined in January, and I talk about my mainstream naivety, because I honestly believe, I think, following on from what you said, Caroline, I thought I would be able to go into I'm in an SEMH school in Oxford, and that you would see the potential to get children back into mainstream. And what's really struck me is actually the damage that's done. And I'm an early years lead, so I'm working with 5, 6 and 7-year-olds, and straight away you look at these children, you go, they're so damaged by their experiences at such a young age that actually there's a I've got 7 in my class, and I think probably 2 of them I could see transitioning back into mainstream, and already I think the damage is so high. And I think all of these conversations about what needs to be different in mainstream, and then it's not, I mean, again, my experience is that there are individual teachers take that responsibility for SEND pupils very, very differently. I think some really do put it at the heart of everything they do, and some, I think, because it challenges them and they find it difficult, or because their vision of what they've gone into teaching to do is to teach children who can learn and who want to learn and who are engaged, and don't stop them from teaching. So I think there's different reasons behind all of that, and therefore that means that children get very different experiences. Sorry, I'm waffling on a bit now, but I just, for me, it's the lack of fairness between it all, the lack of services available, that early intervention, I just think is the kind of going back to that conversation about in the past, children's centres and picking children up early, and that kind of community aspect to it, and knowing who these young children were before they joined primary schools and being able to put things in place before. It's just gone, and I think the avenues for mainstream schools to go to get support are so much more limited as well. So by the time the children come out to me in special school, the damage is quite shocking. Actually, I've been quite surprised by it. That's
really, I mean, it's really shocking and upsetting, but also kind of, again, a message that's repeated in lots of places across the country. And I think, early intervention across all the chapters in this book is, something that comes out a lot, and it's clear with SEND that the sooner that you can work out what needs young people have, the better. I mean, that's sort of almost taken as a given. But as a lot of you have been saying, that's sort of the resources outside of schools to do a lot of that identification kind of either no longer exist, or are so there's so much demand that it can't keep up. So I wonder whether that's maybe something that's like the kind of the final takeaway from this session about the importance of early intervention. And on that note, I can see that we're being asked to leave the breakout room. So I'd just like to thank you all for your interest, and also for your contribution to this session. I've really enjoyed it, and it'd be good to catch up with all of you, and individually I'll see if we can get in touch and continue the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.